Hi, my name's Derek. I'm an alcoholic, and welcome to a video entitled, Are You Ready to Be a Sponsor? What AA suggests. Way more important than what I would suggest is what AA suggests about sponsorship. And for that reason, I'm going to refer directly to sections from the questions and answers on sponsorship pamphlet. Now, this pamphlet is really special. In our fellowship, it's our conference-approved piece of literature on all things sponsorship. I haven't really found another. So this is a central resource for any member who wants to learn about what sponsorship actually is. As our big book is to recovery, so this pamphlet is to sponsorship, or at least that's how I tend to see it. It's specific information on how to go about it, and information that isn't contained in our big book. If you look at the first 164 pages, sponsorship isn't really covered. It's touched upon in some general ways in working with others. You could see working with others, that chapter, that way. But really, working with others is a lot about that specific initial 12-step conversation, which may lead to sponsorship, but certainly isn't sponsorship. And so we need to go to this pamphlet, I feel, to learn specifically what AA suggests. Now, of course, you can get suggestions from within AA, from any particular member on what sponsorship is. And I believe that's how it largely speaking works. Now, that belief is based on evidence. For example, I ran a workshop a few years ago in Melbourne on sponsorship, and there might have been 35, 40 members in the room. And I asked them 3 questions. First question was, do you have a sponsor? And of course, every hand went up. Second question, are you a sponsor? Almost every hand went up. Then I picked up this very pamphlet here and I held it up and I said, how many of you have read this pamphlet? And virtually no hands went up. And I was hoping for a lot more hands. See, how do I know what AA suggests sponsorship is if I haven't read what it suggests sponsorship is? Now, if we get good advice from members and it marries up with this, well, all fine. If we go over and above, well, maybe that's all fine. But what if we're only half sponsoring people? Here's the truth. Here's my story, my experience, lack of strength and hope from a few years ago. I was sponsoring a couple of guys and I hadn't read this pamphlet. And then I did read the pamphlet and I went, oh my God, I'm doing about a third of what is suggested I need to. So I'm third sponsoring people. And I felt, well, that's only going to hold them up in their experience of AA and their recovery. I need to do more. So it sent me off on a path of getting involved in AA in a more broad sense so I could cover off on the 20 suggestions that are in this pamphlet on what sponsors should and shouldn't do. Largely do. There's not very much shouldn't. So we're going to look at 2 sections very quickly today. And hopefully this introduction is motivating you to take an interest. We are members of AA, and it's not the worst thing in the world to look at what the fellowship itself suggests in conference-approved literature around this critical aspect of why we keep coming back. Why make it up for ourselves when we can just do what is suggested? So let's find out what sponsorship actually is from an AA perspective. For that reason, we're going to look at 2 sections. When is a member ready for sponsorship responsibility, and what does the sponsor do and not do? First section, quite short, to the point. I will read it out. Our primary purpose is to carry the message of the AA to the alcoholic who still suffers. Absolutely. AA members who have actually worked the steps of AA as a way to attain sobriety are often in the best position to share their experience, strength, and hope. Now, that means that a sponsor needs to have worked the steps. That's clearly that there are other ways or things that people might do in AA, but the thing that makes us ready for sponsorship seems to be that we have worked the steps. Not we've read them, or not that we've, and I'm using air quotes here, done them, that we have worked them. We've taken the spiritual action. Our lives has changed as a result. And that's where the experience, strength, and hope comes in. You know, we've had this spiritual awakening. The most successful sponsors, it continues, seem to be men and women who have been in AA long enough to have a good understanding of the AA program outlined in the 12 steps. And as we know, understanding comes from action as much as reading. Many of us think it is wise to seek advice from our own sponsors about when we may be ready to take on the responsibility of sponsoring another alcoholic. And I think it's a really sound suggestion. It continues, the member who has been sober for months or years is usually, but not always, able to work more effectively with newcomers than the members whose experience is limited to only a few weeks or days. Thus, length of sobriety is a factor, but not the only factor in successful sponsorship. Okay, now it's really important to recognize that this idea of having completed the 12 steps, put them into our lives, great. Part of the 12th step itself, the second half, is that we're practicing the principles of AA in all our affairs. And perhaps this is where length of sobriety does become a factor because, to practice the principles of the 12 steps in all our affairs means we've taken this into our life, into our general AA experience. And that is very much captured in the 20 suggestions I'm about to read out. Okay. Just as importantly, to finish off, the sponsor should have capacity for understanding, patience, and the willingness to devote time and effort to newcomers. In other words, we have to be in super fit spiritual condition ourselves. That's where understanding and patience seem to come for me. But also, hey, if you're running a business like me, I've never tried to take on more than one or two sponsees because all I'd be doing is letting down the third one and the first two. I need time. And I guess what I take from, the heading for this section, it's not a right to be a sponsor. It's a responsibility. It's an act of giving, not receiving. I may receive. I hope I receive. But ultimately, I'm there to provide an essential experience for the person who is suffering. It's a responsibility. And I have other responsibilities. No one has to be a sponsor in AA. That's the clear suggestion here. Time and effort, got to have the ability to provide both. But let's say we have it. Let's say that, I can, in my case, sponsor a couple of guys. Let's say you can sponsor. Let's see what you're actually doing. So let's get to the second section of the pamphlet. And you'll notice here I've got ticker boxes. Now, yes, I'm providing you with my opinion. It's only that, so take it as read. What I'm going to do is I'm going to outline each of the 20 factors that make up sponsorship in AA, so AA suggests, and I'm going to, as best as I can, as objectively as I can, tick which of these 4 is relevant for that, because a lot of people that I've spoken about sponsorship with in AA, new and not so new, have this view that sponsorship is largely about helping with someone's recovery. But as you know, there are 2 other legacies in AA, unity and service, or more specifically, general service. We know that, that third legacy, service, doesn't necessarily relate directly to, service at the group level where you're buying the milk, for example, or responsible for buying literature, or that sort of thing is sort of like group service. We know that the concepts are about, connecting to AA's organisational structure, the general service structure, considering AA as a whole, a little bit more organised than just service the way it's sometimes described. Not saying that other kind of service isn't super essential. Of course it is, and it lights me up to do it. But, at the end of the day, general service is what it is. So we've got 4 ticker boxes because the 4th is, just fellowship stuff. Hanging out with members, and also outside AA stuff. Practice of the principle in all our affairs. So, does sponsorship only relate to assisting other members with their recovery? Let's find out. Let's let the pamphlet do the talking. First section, a sponsor does everything possible within the limits of personal experience and knowledge to help the newcomer get sober and stay sober through the AA program. Sounds like the steps to me, but equally it could be a little bit broader than that and bring in fellowship and the idea of hanging out with members and being a member of AA in general. That's certainly been part of my personal experience and knowledge. So we're picking up on 2 there in my view. Next. Shows a present example and drinking history what AA has meant. So by present example and drinking history, I should say, what AA has meant in the sponsor's life. So I share my drinking story with the sponsor, probably the way I do at a beginner's meeting or an ID meeting. Sounds like the steps to me. So far, steps in recovery, main focus. Third point, encourages and helps the newcomer to attend a variety of AA meetings to get a number of viewpoints and interpretations of the AA program. This is a super good way of the sponsor remaining absolutely humble and selfless. The idea of my experience of AA should not necessarily be my sponsee's. You can go to any meeting you like. You certainly don't need to come to my meeting. It's that kind of thinking perhaps suggested in this instruction. Depending on how you interpret it, could be different. But the idea of get a broad... I live in a country town, right, in country New South Wales. One of the suggestions I make to my sponsees is do online meetings because there's only a couple in town, but you've got the world at your fingertips. You need to perhaps consider looking at that. That's a sponsor's job. Now, I believe we're looking at steps in recovery again, but equally, because we're experiencing meetings and meetings are run by AA groups, unity in traditions comes in, because what people will experience at a multiplicity of meetings is a whole lot of different group conscience decisions that have actually created that meeting experience. So we're actually seeing the traditions being used because each group is autonomous. Next, suggests keeping an open mind about AA if the newcomer isn't sure at first whether he or she is an alcoholic. Clearly steps in recovery again, so that's been a through line so far. But equally, unity in traditions comes in. Tradition 3, only I can call myself an alcoholic. And I can keep going to meetings even if I don't feel I'm an alcoholic. It gets a bit grey, but I think that there's a connection there. And also the fellowship. This idea of an open mind about AA, I think comes from experiencing not just steps and traditions through big book study with my sponsor, for example. It comes through actually being a part of AA and the open-mindedness and acceptance of the fellowship. I mean, how many of us chose the fellowship itself to be our first initial higher power? Even step 4 in the 12 and 12 suggests that. And so, the fellowship itself becomes a very important part, I feel, of this suggestion. Next, introduces the newcomer to other members. Well, clearly that's not so much about steps in recovery. That's about the fellowship, meeting other members. I've met many other members. We're not just talking 12 steps all the time. We can talk whatever we wish. And again, that idea of I'm enjoying the fellowship side of things, super important. It's also how I got into general service as well. Next, sees that the newcomer is aware of AA literature, in particular the Big Book, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, Grapevine, As Bill Sees It, Living Sober, and suitable pamphlets. Well, okay, that's the lot. Even the Big Book isn't just about recovery. It talks about the traditions as well. The concepts appear in the back of it. 12 and 12 is clearly traditions. The Grapevine, or in Australia, it could be a central service office publication, what members post on the members' website as part of aa.org.au. As Bill Sees It, covers a whole gamut of living, all that stuff. It's clearly about every aspect and facet of the AA experience, and that is the sponsor's opportunity. I go back to these dot points are, like, for example, there's no caveat on this section of the pamphlet saying, well, the recovery stuff's more important than the other stuff. It's all just dot points. The real question is, are you doing it as a sponsor? Because AA suggests that you can. Okay, next, is available to the newcomer when the latter has special problems. Well, some special problems might be about that person's recovery, their alcoholism, or it could be other stuff. Special problems may be outside AA things. I could probably tick the traditions, well, I haven't, but, special problems aren't always related to alcoholism, are they? Goes over the meaning of the 12 steps and emphasises their importance. Ka-ching, that's probably the most traditional understanding of what sponsors do. And it's obviously critical. Even though the book was designed to be read alone, boy, oh boy, I don't know about you, but my experience of going through it with a sponsor seemed to supercharge it and has allowed me to stay sober over 10 years. Next, urges the newcomer to join in group activities as soon as possible. Group activities, well, it all depends on what the activity is. And my experience of group activities, it can stem from everything to do, pure steps and recovery workshops all the way through to, sausage sizzles and just having fun, getting together and watching the grand final, whatever it is. It's a host of things. We are not a glum lot. Next, impresses upon the newcomer the importance of all our traditions. And this is the one that really made me go, what? Hang on a second. As a sponsor, I impress upon the newcomer the importance of all our traditions. So therefore, I need to understand them. I need to read AA Comes of Age. I need to read the 12 and 12 and probably get involved in general service. Find a home group that wants to do more than just host a meeting, but actually do, things like public information in the community and be more of a 24/7 type group. That really changed. Like I went looking for that kind of a home group because I knew I was under on the traditions. And it's fine to read them, isn't it? But actually, we've got to action them. We've got to find the members that allow us to action and experience AA unity through the traditions. And it's been the bright spot of the last half a decade of my recovery. But I go back to, this is the sponsorship pamphlet, and this is one of the suggestions as to what sponsors do. And so this was quite confronting for me initially, but then I got off my backside and gave new stuff a go. The illustrated traditions, there's also an illustrated concepts, great stuff, really cool old school diagrams that are kind of retro appealing. I really like this one. Anyway, food for thought. Next, we start to get more into traditions. All right, and this is specifically about two. So it's a subset of our traditions in general, emphasizes the relevance and spiritual value of anonymity, both on a person-to-person basis as well as the public level, including social media. You can look at the Understanding Anonymity pamphlet. It's very useful, as are other reference points, including the 12 and 12, and just understanding the long and short form of the traditions themselves. Either way, this is what sponsors need to be incredibly over in regards to supporting a sponsee. Now, I know, having done lots of work at district and area, that even if you're on a district or area committee, it is hard to always understand the subtleties of anonymity, whether it relates to spiritual foundations or public relations. It's not the easiest thing to get your head around, but if you want to be a complete sponsor, that's an opportunity. It's part of what we are encouraged to do by AA itself. Next, tries to give the newcomer some picture of the scope of AA beyond the group and directs, in other words, general service or central service, and directs the attention to AA literature about the history of the fellowship. For example, AA Comes of Age, Dr. Bob and the Old Timers, the three legacies, including general service, the service structure, and the worldwide availability of AA wherever the newcomer may go. So, this starts to be this global understanding, at least at a general level, of how AA operates as a fellowship, even as an organisation, if you want to use that word, which means every sponsor, it's suggested, needs to be able to unpack the way leadership and service work organisationally within AA. We need to know we have a board. Now, in Australia, we have a board. The Americans and Canadians have AA World Services. It's a different it's a different fellowship, not a same fellowship. It's a different conference. Okay, it's called AA World Services. In Australia, it's called AA Australia, but it uses the same, what we call an upside down pyramid. So I'm sure I'm sort of mansplaining to this to you or to some of you, but I'm also fairly confident I may be explaining this structure for the first time for some of the viewers here. So apologies if you were in the former category, but there are numerous resources to explain how AA functions. And the US or Australian Service Manual is a really good starting point if you want to be that vigilant, complete sponsor. Explains the program to relatives of the alcoholic if this appears to be useful, and tell them about Al-Anon family groups and Alateen. Thank God for Al-Anon. I've probably said that more in the last 10 years than thank God for AA. If you've got the phone line, family members ring up, and at times that's where we get to suggest Al-Anon. Sometimes it's when we get to know a little bit more about our sponsees and we go to a barbecue at their place. We have an opportunity. We don't push, we don't sell, but the amount of times I've said to someone, check out Al-Anon's website, and this is the landing page for that. We're not here to sell Al-Anon, but we are encouraged as sponsees to suggest it. We're only trying to help people. And sometimes it's the friends and family who are struggling as much as the alcoholic themselves. Next, quickly admits, I don't know, when that is the case, and helps the newcomer find a good source of information. So we don't have to be the academic expert on all of this stuff. There's quite a lot of stuff out there for us to absorb, but you just need to know where it is. All right. For general service, guidelines, AA group handbook, the AA Australia Service Manual. For traditions, it's the 12 and 12 and numerous other texts. There's always an answer somewhere. And sometimes we can ask the GSR of our group or an older sober member, where can I find that out? It's usually good to try and find the conference-approved literature to make sure that we're providing the newcomer with what AA suggests rather than a personal opinion or half of the AA suggestion. And it's out there. Someone usually knows something. And of course, we're covering every aspect of our 4 boxes. The sponsor encourages the newcomer to work with other alcoholics as soon as possible, and sometimes begins by taking the newcomer along to 12-step calls. Now, this is not suggesting that that person sponsors. It just suggests work with other alcoholics. And if we go back to the big book and the starting couple of paragraphs with working with others, that chapter, it's about working with newcomers in that 12th step conversation way. And, you may not feel ready for sponsorship and, because there's obviously a lot we need to know before we can provide complete sponsorship, but you may certainly be ready after not a long period of time to have those 12-step conversations. And it used to happen all the time. Old timers talk about taking newcomers on 12-step calls, and there's modern day equivalents like going to a detox and talking to the people at the detox or the rehab and going out with an experienced older sober member and, sharing your story, but equally observing what that member does so that you can replicate it. And I think that here, it's not an encouragement to become the next sponsor necessarily. As I say, it's about that more, ground zero 12th step stuff that is, the hallmark of step 12. And in fact, the hallmark of where we, a little bit further down the track, we choose to get sponsorship because someone's explained the disease and the solution very well to us. That certainly was my experience. And of course, that is hardcore steps and recovery stuff, well and truly. Never takes the newcomer's inventory except when asked. So we know what taking an inventory is. It's telling people about them, which is an interesting suggestion given what sponsorship is sometimes seen as. It seems to me, this one demands interpretation, I feel. It's an interesting thing to have a suggestion, we can't be too leading with a newcomer. We have to wait to be invited to take their inventory, to tell them what we think of them. And that is not always the way I've had sponsorship described to me, but yet here it is in an AA pamphlet. And probably we're looking at Well, we could probably look at all four depending on how they behave in group consciences or district meetings, but probably it's steps in recovery and again, general fellowship stuff. But that's an interesting one that I'm still pondering and thinking about, praying over. Never tries, I should say, to impose personal views on the newcomer. A good sponsor who is an atheist, for example, does not try to persuade a religious newcomer to abandon faith, nor does a religious sponsor argue theological matters with an agnostic newcomer. So what I believe personally, and in fact where my program and my higher power have taken me personally, are of no consequence to sponsorship. I guess this is one of those should nots, and equally, basically it's telling me just stick to all the shoulds. You don't need to go further than that. And it's a really good suggestion. It's something that I have tried my best to train myself out of doing. You don't need my personal viewpoint. You need me to show you what AA suggests. That's what sponsorship seems to be about. Probably steps in recovery, although to be honest, I'm being a bit conservative there. I think that my opinion on how AA is operating nationally is something that I've learned to not share with sponsors, etc., etc. Does not pretend to know all the answers. It does not keep up a pretense of being right all the time. That sounds like more about the sponsor's recovery rather than the sponsees, but that can be about anything, right? If we're not humble, we probably need to revoke our sponsorship opportunity. We've got to just be there for them, I guess, on their terms, not ours. And being humble enough to, I don't know, maybe, my sponsor's really good at this one. And usually it ends with, well, two things. Number one, what would Jesus do? Which is an interesting thing to ponder. Or why don't you pray about it, Derek? Well, I could pray about it because ultimately that's what's the whole show's about, trusting in God, not always my sponsor. Sees that the newcomer is aware of AA literature. I've done that already. I apologise. It's a glitch. An AA sponsor does not offer professional services such as those provided by counsellors, the legal, medical or social work communities, but may sometimes help the newcomer to access professional help if assistance outside the scope of AA is needed. So this is really a reiteration of one of our traditions, Tradition 8. But equally, it's also a reminder that we don't charge for step and recovery work. It's not service. That's our recovery. We're not providing a service. We are keeping ourselves sober as part of our 12th step responsibility for ourselves. It's not service helping someone get sober, it's recovery. But the idea of we don't do that professionally, perhaps with non-sponsees, well, that steps on the eighth tradition, and probably goes further into how we behave as a fellowship. It's a really nice one. Stresses the importance of AA being this is the last one, being a safe place for all members, and encourages members to become familiar with service material available from the General Service Office, such as Safety in AA, Our Common Welfare. Well, this is general service because we're looking at, if you like, even legal matters. AA is not above any law of any land, but equally, it's our steps and recovery gets impacted too, because if I feel unsafe and stop going to a meeting, I may pick up a drink as a result. So it's really important that as a sponsor, I'm aware of such things in AA Australia as these. Well, here's the Safety in AA flyer, right? But also in AA Australia, and these are unique to AA, we have a child safe guideline. And when you read it, it says there it's important for AA members to be aware that when we are working with children and young people, they share in this responsibility. Now, that's something that every organisation has, a child safe guideline. But, we have that in AA, and it's important that a sponsor makes a sponsee aware of that. And it's a really interesting document, as is the AA guideline for safety at meetings. Now, every AA group has the opportunity to enact that guideline. This is something that was agreed to by all the groups via our national conference just a few years ago. Now, whether it's the guidelines or the flyer, it's a sponsor's responsibility to make the sponsee aware of their rights as a member and equally their responsibility. Safe meetings, safe groups, safe AA equals probably a lot more people hanging around, coming back and turning their lives around. So I guess I want to say thank you if you're still watching. I'm going to say it again. When I read this pamphlet, I was blown away at the scope and scale, the width and breadth of the sponsorship opportunity, the sponsorship responsibility. And I just was focusing on my sponsee's recovery. And it's not just that. Now, that's not my opinion. That's just me reading from the pamphlet. Who knows? That's what I get from this pamphlet. If you want to get something from it, give it a go, have a read, and have a happy, sober day.